Oftentimes, when the topic of unconscious bias is raised, the reaction is, "What? Who, me? How dare you?" I think this reaction stems from the fact that unconscious bias is not well understood and is often misused. So in this module, we'll learn what unconscious bias actually is, discuss some of the typical types of biases and when they come into play, and explore why it is important to think about it in our daily lives. So let's start with the basics. First, you may have heard the term implicit bias. Unconscious bias and implicit bias are synonymous. From what I've seen in the literature, there is no distinction between the two. I just happen to prefer unconscious bias for now. Okay, so first thing to know, everyone has biases. It doesn't mean you're a bad person, just that you have a brain. In fact, it's almost as if you have two brains, or at least two types of brain functioning. For the sake of simplicity, I'll refer to these two types of functioning as fast brain and slow brain. Biases are cognitive shortcuts that our fast brain uses to sort and make sense of a lot of information very quickly. As we'll discuss later, we rely on those shortcuts to go about our day. We have both positive biases and negative biases. Some of our biases or preferences we are fully aware of, such as my bias for any dessert containing chocolate. But the issue we are concerned with are our unconscious biases, because they can operate outside of our conscious awareness. And this is the worst part. Our unconscious biases are involuntary and can in fact conflict with how we feel consciously. I think this is why unconscious bias is almost a taboo topic, because admitting our biases, even to ourselves, can provoke feelings of guilt or shame. The good news, bad news is that biases can be overridden, but not overwritten. In other words, our biases are deeply ingrained neural pathways that cannot be erased. However, through ongoing effort, we can learn to override and not act upon our biases, and eventually they get weaker, but they're still there. So that's the big overview. Now let's delve in a little deeper. As you can see from this highly accurate and realistic brain map, there's a lot of information stored in our brain. When we encounter something or someone that requires some sort of processing or sense-making, our fast brain processes do this very quickly by finding some bit of information already stored in the brain to apply to the person or situation at hand. Among those bits of information are our past experiences in the form of memories, which are often distorted. We also have a barrage of images, ideas, and judgments that are constantly reinforced through media exposure. And again, it's important to remember that we may not consciously agree with some of these ideas and judgments, but they still can make their way into our conscious minds. Our fast brain also relies on stored information in the form of stereotypes that are used to explain things. For example, if we see a homeless person asking for money on the street, our fast brain might associate that person with drug addiction or mental illness. And that might be right some of the time. But we also know that there are a myriad of other reasons why someone can end up homeless, from domestic abuse to home foreclosure to a chronic illness. But typically, our fast brain stops after the most readily available and seemingly appropriate conclusion is made. Now let's take a look at some of the ways that these bits of information come out in the form of biases. So what do we do when we're pressed for time? We take shortcuts. That's what our fast brains do as well. Similarity bias, confirmation bias, and halo effect are three common shortcuts that end up affecting our decision-making, whether we know it or not. Similarity bias refers to our unconscious preference towards those who are similar to us. And that's not just because we think we are awesome and others like us are as well. It's because when we perceive similarity, there's a lot less cognitive work that we need to do in order to figure things out. When someone seems similar to us in terms of some aspect of our identities, we feel more at ease. We feel like there is some sense of shared understanding or shared connection. Similarity bias is often apparent in hiring and promotion processes when people who make decisions feel drawn to those who are similar to themselves in any number of ways. Confirmation bias is the effect of focusing in on that which confirms our idea about what someone or something is like, and, by extension, we tend to filter out information that disconfirms our previously existing stored information. So if we have a similarity bias towards someone like us, chances are that we will pick up on things that confirm that bias and miss out on other important pieces of information. And the same can go for when we have negative biases towards groups of people. We pick up on information that confirms that negative bias and miss or dismiss things that contradict that negative bias. Confirmation biases often come into play when we are evaluating another person's behaviors or their work. We pick up on things that confirm what we already believe about people and miss other things that may be important. The last one we'll discuss is the halo effect, which is closely related to the previous ones. The halo effect happens when there is one characteristic that we like about someone, such as the way they look, their fancy title, or some commonality we share with them, such as where we grew up or went to school. We're predisposed to interpret the rest of the information through the golden light of this halo. So, when we are reviewing someone's resume, for example, and we see that they grew up in the same place as we did, we may unconsciously be predisposed to be really impressed with the rest of their resume, whereas we might see the same accomplishments on another person's resume who happens to have a name that looks strange to us, and we might be less impressed by those very same qualifications. As I mentioned at the beginning, unconscious biases are created from bits of information stored in our brain. Unfortunately, we cannot overwrite these bits of information. The neural pathways are permanent, but we can actively override them so that we minimize their capacity to affect our decision-making and behavior. There are 3 steps that are useful for overriding biases. Let's break them down one at a time. First, it is important to recognize work conditions that are ripe for unconscious biases to come into play. Errors related to unconscious biases tend to come into play in situations when you are pressed for time and you need to accomplish tasks quickly. Sound familiar? We are also at risk under conditions of stress, such as conflict at work, issues going on at home, or environmental stress, such as noise, other people's emotions, or distractions. Multitasking is another risk factor. When we do several things at a time, our automated processes are in overdrive and definitely prone to unconscious bias. Our standard daily routines are another area prone to unconscious bias because routines are by nature automated processes. We don't have to think about them, we just do them. So this is a time when our fast brain takes over and our slow brain goes elsewhere. Since these are working conditions that most of us find ourselves in at some point or another, if not most of the time, I'd like for you to pause the video and take a moment and do an inventory of some of your work-related or daily life tasks that involve big or small decisions or judgment calls. Think about the work conditions when you are doing these tasks or making those decisions. Which of those tasks might be prone to similarity bias, confirmation bias, or the halo effect? A very helpful way to become skillful in slowing down is to regularly practice mindfulness. There are various definitions of mindfulness. At the most basic level, mindfulness is the practice of being attuned to both your internal and external experiences in the present moment. It entails quieting down and tuning in to your own thoughts, feelings, and bodily sensations. Not only does mindfulness generate a sense of well-being and relieve stress, it is a critical step to overriding unconscious biases. To help understand mindfulness, I think it's helpful to look at related words. Some synonyms for mindfulness are alive, aware, cognizant, conscious, thoughtful, and knowledgeable. And the importance of these concepts is really driven home when we think about the opposite of mindfulness: insensitive, oblivious, unaware, unconscious, unmindful, unwitting. These antonyms make it clear that lack of mindfulness can really get us into trouble. The good news is that even the simple act of taking a deep breath and exhaling slowly is a mindfulness practice, and it brings oxygen to the brain, which helps us engage our slow brain thinking, which brings us to the final step. The final step is to get our slow brain thinking by trying to identify the assumptions, associations, and logic that our fast brain is using in a particular situation. In other words, we need to think about our thinking. We also need to question our own intuition and preferences. We can avoid confirmation bias by asking questions that help us see what we may be missing. And since it is sometimes hard to recognize our own biases at play, it can be helpful to get fresh and different eyes on the situation. And finally, by increasing your exposure to counter stereotypes and different perspectives, you add bits of information stored in your brain, and it will eventually become easier to access it. As you will see in the additional resources section, most of the research on unconscious bias focuses on gender and race. However, it is important to note that we have positive and negative biases about all kinds of identities and appearances. And here's a really important point to remember. Regardless of your race, gender, social class, age, etc., we are all socialized into the same society. So while our individual experiences differ, we are also raised in a society that tells us that pink is for girls and blue is for boys, that men are firefighters and women are primary caretakers of children. We are told that if you work hard enough, you can succeed. We are told that black men are dangerous. We are told that a family means man, woman, and child. We're told that obese people are lazy. Whether we believe these things in our conscious mind is another matter. But these ideas, images, assumptions are unconsciously embedded in our minds, whether we like it or not. So yes, women can have unconscious bias against women. African Americans can have unconscious bias against other African Americans, and so on. This is a hard thing to grapple with, but if we face it, we can resist it. And it is critically important that we do learn to resist or override our biases, because the impact of biases is cumulative and systemic. Negative and positive biases are reoccurring over the lifetime of a person in a wide variety of contexts. So people who are subject to positive biases get slowly nudged upwards, while people who are subject to negative biases have an upward battle. And when people in a particular identity group are widely and consistently subject to biases, it creates systemic disparities in all aspects of society, such as education, employment, healthcare, housing, and so on. Overriding biases is ongoing work. The good news is that by taking this course, you are already on the right path. The bad news is that it is not enough. Getting better at overriding biases takes ongoing effort. It means being mindful as often as you can. It means grappling with feelings of discomfort. It means intentionally exposing yourself to people and ideas that are different than what you're used to. But I promise you that the work and effort are worth it. Not only will your own life be enriched, but you'll be able to make a valuable contribution towards bringing our beloved universities towards inclusive excellence.